A fire broke out at a home in the small town of Roaring Spring, Kentucky. There was a family inside. Firefighters fought to save them, but once the fire was out, they determined something much more sinister had happened. This is the story of the Frensley family. Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Kimbyrleigha. If you've never been here before, nice to finally meet you. And if you have been here before and you haven't subscribed, I would love it if you would do so. And also turn the notification bell on, even though I usually post on Thursdays, you never know. Sometimes I'm a little late. And like usual, before I get into this video, I would really like you to give just a moment of your time for our sponsor today. Today's sponsor is Magellan TV, and maybe you've heard of Magellan TV before, but have you heard of the documentary called Urban Legends? That's what I've been watching this week on Magellan TV. Remember Urban Legends when we were growing up? People would say something outlandish happened, like Bloody Mary, and I'm not talking about the drink, but the famous tale that claimed if you go in a bathroom, turn out the lights, and look into the mirror while saying her name 3 times, she will appear. Well, the new release, Urban Legends on Magellan TV, brings those stories to life. Each episode features 3 amazing tales, stories that are so incredible and far-fetched, you're not sure whether to believe them or not. These stories are all presented as fact. They're pieced together from dramatic reconstructions to look like genuine documentary-style reports. The twist is that some stories are true and some stories are false. It's up to the viewers to figure out which ones, and I personally love that. It's so much fun to watch with my boyfriend, John. We make bets on which one we think is true, and whoever's wrong has to buy dinner or do a chore or something else that's just really fun. It tests your knowledge, and also I really like how between each one of the stories, they have what they call mini myths. This is where they tell you about something that you've probably heard was true, and then they debunk it and tell you whether or not it really happened. For example, I don't know if you've ever heard the one about the girl that was driving at night, and there was this car behind her that kept flashing their high beams. So she pulls over into a gas station. She runs inside to get away from the driver. But it turns out there was actually a guy in the backseat of her car trying to stab her with a knife. And the guy that was driving behind her was flashing his high beams, trying to stop that guy from doing what he was doing, and was blinding the guy through her rearview mirror. Have you heard of it? Well, I'm not going to tell you whether it's true or not. Let me know in the comments what you think. And don't forget to check out Urban Legends. The last episode we watched, one of the stories was this guy that supposedly got rolled over by a steamroller and survived. The other one was a soldier. He was in the army and he didn't want to do his cleaning. He had just had it. So he tried to throw this really large floor cleaner out the window and almost killed his general with a cord that got wrapped around him. And then the last one was this guy who got trapped under the snow, and he decided to pee his way out of his car. And we had to decide which one of these was true. And of course, I'm not going to tell you which one. You have to watch it for yourself. And I really think you're going to like it because even though it's a mix of 2 fake stories, every episode you get to know a real life story that sounds so crazy that it couldn't be real, and you get to learn about the people who experienced it. It's great to have something like Magellan TV to watch, especially if I'm late one week posting and you're just desperate to find something to hold you over. Well, Magellan TV adds 15 to 20 hours of new content each week, so true crime fans will never run out of something to watch. You can stream thousands of documentaries on Magellan TV. There are shows on true crime, history, war, earth science, and much more. 3,000 plus documentaries with new content added every single week. Now is the time to take advantage of my special offer. My viewers, all of you, get a 1-month free trial by clicking on the link in my description box, so you can watch Urban Legends and the rest of Magellan TV's extensive true crime collection. And documentaries just like Urban Legends and so many more are added every week, so check out my link and tell me what you think. And thank you so much to Magellan TV for sponsoring today's video. Now let's get into the case for today. It's the evening of October 15th, 2008. Emergency personnel are rushing around Jenny Stewart Medical Center in Hopkinsville, Kentucky, as a patient in critical condition is about to be transported into their emergency department from the small rural community of Roaring Spring, about 16 miles away. The information known to authorities at this time was that a fire had engulfed a property where a female had been found outside in the backyard, badly injured, burned, and clinging to life. The patient was identified as 36-year-old mother of 3, Christy Frensley. Upon her arrival and subsequent medical assessment, it was determined that Christy would need to have immediate and extensive life-saving surgery, which included placing her in a medically induced coma. No one knew what happened to Christy, and she was unable to speak. About 30 people were gathered outside the hospital. They were waiting for updates on Christy's condition, but it would be a while before they knew whether Christy would pull through. Meanwhile, police are trying to find out as much information about her as possible in an attempt to piece together the events that led to this horrific situation. Deputy Kenneth Butts, who accompanied Christy to the hospital via ambulance, was also a close friend of hers. Christy was his daughter-in-law's best friend. He had known her most of her life. He held her hand and her head the entire ride. He was able to provide information about her identity and how she was found. He was a former firefighter and the first officer on the scene. He was directed to the backyard of her residence located at 169 Military Road in Roaring Springs, where he found Christy floating inside her above-ground pool. It was connected to a deck attached to a few stairs that led to a set of French doors to a main bedroom of her one-story home that she shared with her children. It was apparent that her wounds were life-threatening. He observed cuts to the back and front of Christy's neck. Shocked, he frantically asked Christy, "Who did this to you?" and if she knew them. Before I tell you what happened next, let me tell you who Christy Frensley is and the life she was living before that fateful fall afternoon in 2008, when she would find herself close to death in her own backyard and now fighting for her life in surgery. Christy was born in May of 1972 to parents Michael and Linda Glass, but she said that even though that's when life began for her, Christy's favorite 3 chapters of her life are when her 3 children were born. Becoming their mother was what she was the most proud of. She lived for her children. Christy married Doug Williams, and by May 19, 1991, they were welcoming their daughter Kayla Elaine Williams into the world. Christy was only 19 at the time. She was overjoyed, but it wasn't long before it became apparent that things were not going to work out between her and Doug. They divorced soon after Kayla was born. And just a few years later, by 1994, Christy was about to have her second child, another daughter that she named Courtney Land McBurney. Courtney's father, Roy McBurney, did not become a fixture in his daughter's life. Instead, Christy found herself as a single mother of 2 girls until she met and fell in love with Jeff Hugh Frensley II, a U.S. Master Army Sergeant stationed at Fort Campbell Military Base located on the Kentucky-Tennessee border. Christy ended up marrying Jeff, and her daughter Courtney even took his last name. She became Courtney Land McBurney Frensley, and Jeff adopted her. Then just 3 years later, on January 26, 2003, Christy and Jeff had a son together who they named Ethan Zane Frensley. Now they were a family of 5, with Kayla 12 years old, Courtney 9, and newborn Ethan to add to the mix, and life was very busy in the Frensley household. They were living in the Roaring Spring neighborhood, a rural, close-knit, safe community where everyone knew one another and never locked their doors. It was conveniently only 25 minutes away from Fort Campbell. This is what Roaring Spring looks like from a bird's eye view. Very green, the homes are on a lot of land, but they're close enough together for residents to develop a strong sense of community. You get to experience 4 distinct seasons in this part of Kentucky as well, and that means there are a variety of different activities and events every season. This brings in locals and visitors as well. The cost of living is low, and there are many beautiful areas nearby. Not to mention, many active military and veterans decide to settle down here since it's close to Fort Campbell. Roaring Spring is part of Trigg County. The main and most lively area is the city of Cadiz, which is about 25 minutes north, and that's where all the schools are, where the downtown area is, and you can find lots of restaurants and shopping and social events taking place. Buses would transport children to and from Roaring Spring to Cadiz on the weekdays to attend school. Kayla and Courtney, only being about 3 years apart, were very close growing up. However, after her sophomore year in high school, Kayla did decide to go live with her biological father, Doug Williams, in California for a little while. Things were good in the Frensleys' lives until they weren't. Issues were brewing between Jeff and Christy. By the time 2007 rolled around, it would prove to be a very challenging year. They were in the middle of a heated divorce and custody battle over 4-year-old Ethan. Christy had also recently lost her job as a hairstylist. The divorce was finalized in February, and in July, the court granted Christy custody of Ethan and ownership of the family home that they were living in at 169 Military Road in Roaring Spring. Jeff moved out, but then the same month, he submitted for temporary custody of his son, citing that Christy was endangering Ethan by being intoxicated in front of the kids, keeping the house a mess, and she wasn't taking Ethan to regular doctor's appointments. The court granted the temporary switch of custody from Christy to Jeff while these allegations were being investigated, and Ethan began living with his father and attending kindergarten in Clarksville, Tennessee. This was a tough time for everyone, but especially tough on Christy, whose world revolved around her children. Ultimately, Trigg Circuit Judge C.A. Woodall determined that Jeff's claims were unfounded. There was no evidence to support that Christy had any problems with substance abuse. She even submitted to court-ordered drug tests, which all came back negative for illicit drugs. Therefore, on October 1st, 2008, the judge decided not to permanently alter the custody agreement, and Ethan went back into Christy's care after months of being separated from his mother. While all of this was going on, 17-year-old Kayla had decided to move back from California. She had been with her biological dad, Doug, and back in with Christy, and she began to attend Trigg County High School with her 14-year-old sister, Courtney. She wanted to spend some time with that side of her family until she graduated. Then she had plans to return to her father's out in California to go to college. It didn't take long for Christy and the kids to get back into the swing of things. Christy's oldest daughter, Kayla, was already well known in the town. She had grown up there, and now she was back. Her best friend from childhood, Danielle Riddick, couldn't have been more excited. Her and Kayla had been inseparable since middle school when they were on the yearbook staff together. They even had an entire page in the yearbook filled with pictures of just the two of them. Danielle was so sad when Kayla moved away, but they talked on the phone every day. So she felt like her best friend had never really left, but now they were reunited. They enjoyed going to the movies, attending football games, and just being ordinary teenage girls. They spent many sunny days in Kayla's backyard, which everyone referred to as the beach house because the pool area was like a little oasis. Kayla was a beautiful, studious, popular, athletic teenager. She looked a lot like her mama. She was the secretary of the senior class, part of the high school's dance team, and she was the chapter president of Family, Career, and Community Leaders of America. Taking on this role allowed Kayla to motivate and inspire her classmates. But she was like most girls her age. She just enjoyed spending time with friends, being outside in the sunlight, especially if that meant jogging around her neighborhood, playing soccer, swimming, and of course, four-wheeling, which she loved to do. What Kayla was looking forward to the most was getting her driver's license. 14-year-old freshman and middle child Courtney was a bit quieter than her older sister, and like many teens, she liked spending time on social media. The go-to websites at the time were MySpace and Bebo, where she had profiles that said she loved God, and she was the happiest when she was around her friends and skateboarding. She listed her favorite music as hard rock and rap, and her favorite food as chicken and dumplings. We actually share a favorite color, orange, and I don't hear that a lot. Her biggest fear was sharks. Her sunny personality and bright smile reflected her positive attitude towards life. She was always willing to help classmates and teachers, never wanting to disappoint anyone. Courtney had been interested in becoming an orthodontist since she was just a little girl, and she hoped to pursue that dream one day. Both of Christy's daughters adored their little brother, Ethan. They were always looking out for him, playing with him, and making sure he was taken care of. He was adorable. It was hard not to love little Ethan. Everywhere he went, he was making people smile. He was just so fun and full of life. Like many little boys his age, he would talk nonstop. He loved being outside, riding his bike. He loved animals, and he had a special love for bugs. Ethan enjoyed collecting earthworms and bringing them home to his mom in Ziploc bags. Despite being new to the school, Ethan was already well known by the staff at Trigg County Primary School. He had attended preschool at Cadiz Methodist Church before beginning kindergarten back in Tennessee with his dad. But now he was back in Roaring Spring. He loved to dance with his classmates, especially to the Nutcracker, and he was known throughout the school for his incredible hugs that made everyone around him feel loved and appreciated. And despite his young age, Ethan left a lasting impression on the people he interacted with. He seemed a bit of what some people call an old soul. Contrary to what her ex-husband Jeff may have said in his court filings, Christy did not keep a messy house. She took pride in her home. She kept the landscaping very neat and loved spending time in her flower garden. And that's where you could find her anytime she had time off. And now that she was between jobs, she was spending more time tending to her garden. But there was another reason she wanted to make the home look nice and have curb appeal. She had recently put it up for sale through a realty agency called Service First. Even though she loved the Roaring Spring area, it was time for a change. She was sick of the 20-minute commute into Trigg County anytime she needed anything. She and the kids looked forward to selling their home and moving closer to town. Now I want to jump back to October 15th. It was a normal day. Kayla, Courtney, and Ethan left on the school bus that morning. They were expected to be dropped back off by the bus at 4 p.m. like every other school day. But just 58 minutes past 4 p.m., a neighbor called 911 to report black smoke billowing out of Christy's home, which was directly across the street from the Roaring Spring Volunteer Fire Department, mere yards away. Karen Walker was one of the first residents to see the blaze after picking her son up from school. When she realized that Christy's Jeep was parked in the driveway, she knew Christy and the kids were probably inside the house. Karen stopped. She began screaming, "There are babies in there!" A man named Sean Lowry, who lived on a nearby road and had been in the middle of packing for his deployment to Afghanistan, noticed the smoke and heard the commotion. When he heard someone scream, "There are kids inside the house," he jumped into action, running right into the burning house through the front door. He yelled to see if anyone was inside, but he didn't get an answer and he wasn't able to hear anything. Then the fire began raging even bigger, making it hard to breathe because of the smoke, and the heat became too overwhelming for Sean. He couldn't keep going, so he ran back outside. It was a frantic scene as they waited for firefighters to arrive. Although right across the street, it took them 9 minutes to get to Christy's house after that initial 911 call came in. But you know how this goes. Someone calls, they try to figure out what's going on, they transfer you to another department. At 5:15, locals John Schrecker, a Hopkinsville businessman, and John McGuigan, a physician, were out for a bike ride when they saw a bunch of smoke coming from a home in Roaring Spring. Then 2 ambulances raced past them. They followed the emergency vehicles and they saw the house up in flames. John Schrecker was the one that took this photo with his phone, one of the only photos I've seen of the house on fire. At that point, emergency personnel were just arriving on the scene, and there was a police officer already blocking off the driveway with caution tape. We know that Christy Frensley was transported to Jenny Stewart Medical Center that evening after being spotted floating in her pool. That is where I left off. When Christy was admitted to the hospital, she was cold to the touch and had a rapid heart rate. Yes, Christy has sustained burns, but the other injuries were not consistent with the house fire. When being examined, doctors noticed Christy had a fractured skull, several life-threatening stab wounds to her neck, and her ear canal and vocal cords had been severed. It wasn't until an x-ray was done that doctors discovered a broken-off butter knife lodged in her neck. Dr. Francis Marshall Van Meter removed that knife during surgery and closed up what wounds he could. It was obvious that someone had tried to murder her. But who? Close friend and Deputy Kenneth Butts explained that when he saw Christy, he said, "What happened?" She said someone forced themselves on her. She used the R word that I can't use here. But the deputy said, "Christy, who did this?" She said, "I don't know him." That's all the information that they had, but it was enough to make sure that they collected a vaginal swab as part of this investigation before she was taken away and into surgery. Miraculously, Christy survived, but it would take several hours before she was able to communicate with anyone again. As she went in and out of consciousness, she asked about her children. She was told that they were in good hands, and what was important right now was that she got some rest. They needed Christy to pull through so they could ask her important questions that would hopefully lead to the arrest of the man that did this to her. There were so many questions, and it would be 3 days before Christy was coherent enough to understand the gravity of this situation and provide any information to police. Christy was well known and loved in her community. Everyone was waiting for her to wake up. Her family, friends, and even local law enforcement agents were close to Christy and were praying for her recovery. Finally, Christy was awake and surrounded by familiar faces. Everyone in the room was happy that Christy had made it out alive. This poor woman had already been through so much, but now investigators want to speak to her. The sooner the better, so she remembers as much as she can. The longer they wait, Christy could forget everything. It's tough, because they know that it's best for her to rest, but she won't be leaving the hospital anytime soon. It's going to be a long road to recovery. But they let her know that they're counting on her to tell them what happened. As tough as it is, Christy wants to tell her story. Her last thought when she was inside her pool before being rescued was that she couldn't believe what had just happened. What started out as an ordinary day ended up being the worst day of Christy's life. And now she was about to have to relive it. What I'm about to tell you are Christy's words. This is Christy's story. I'm going to try not to deviate from what she told investigators. This is what I found in legal documents and what I heard her say in her own words in interviews. Christy is alive to tell each and every horrific detail of what this monster did to her on October 15th, 2008. This story actually started a week before October 15th, when Christy and the kids were outside doing some yard work. A man that she had never seen before walked up to her property. He looked like he was in his 40s. He kind of had like the salt and pepper kind of hair. Nothing really noteworthy about his appearance overall. The man said he was looking for a person that lived in the neighborhood, and when he asked Christy and the kids, they didn't know who this person was that he was looking for, so the man left. Christy said that she didn't think anything of it at the time, but that same man approached her house a week later on the afternoon of October 15th while Christy's kids were at school. Christy was in her yard, she was on the phone with a friend, and the man came into her backyard. She recognized him to be the same man who came around a week prior. But this time, he wasn't asking about someone. He was inquiring about Christy's house for sale. He asked her if she would be able to give him a little tour. He said he was interested in purchasing a home in the area, so Christy told her friend, hey, I gotta go. She got off the phone, and at first, she was hesitant. She was hesitant about letting a stranger inside, but she thought to herself, you know what? He's wearing his DirecTV work shirt, and for those that aren't familiar, this is a cable TV company work shirt. So she figured, you know what? He's probably in the neighborhood just working, and he stopped by real fast to look at the house. So she agreed to give him a tour inside. That would prove to be the worst decision of her life. They came inside the home together. She started showing the man the living room first, then the laundry room, which was off the living room. He was just kind of standing behind her the whole time, following her through the house, and he was silent. He wasn't asking any questions, which Christy thought was a little weird. Then she began showing him the bathroom, and that's when things changed. The man grabbed Christy around the neck, and he held a gun to her head and told her, do what he said, and no one would get hurt. Christy was shocked. She was scared. She had no idea what was going to happen. She had no idea why he was there and what he wanted. Then he forced her into her son Ethan's bedroom. He pushed Christy's face down on her son's bed and put her hands behind her back. He took out zip ties and began putting them on her wrists, tying them together behind her back. Then he used zip ties to tie her ankles together as well. The man was quiet the whole time. He was calm. And then he took her from Ethan's room and moved her into her own bedroom and forced her to sit up on the bed with her legs and arms still bound. That's when the man began to speak. First, he asked Christy if there were any guns in the house, and she said no. Then he wanted to know who lived there. Christy didn't lie. She told him she lived there with their 3 children. He asked how old they were. Christy said 17, 14, and 5 years old. Again, the man asked if anyone else lived in this house with them, and she said, no, it's just us. He asked if Christy was divorced, and she said yes. Then he said, are you sure that no one else lives in this house with you? And Christy again told him no. This next part is strange. The man begins to pace back and forth all throughout the house. He was opening and closing the windows, looking outside, looking into her backyard, and Christy had no idea what he was doing. She was hoping that he would just hurry up and take or do whatever he was going to do and just leave. Then he asked Christy when her kids were going to get home from school. This time, Christy did lie. She told him 3:45, even though she knew it would be closer to 3:50 or 4 o'clock. At that point, the man tells her that he wants to smoke a cigarette and he wants Christy to smoke one too. Very odd. He puts a cigarette into Christy's mouth. She tells him, I can't smoke a cigarette without a drink of tea, Coke. I have to have something. He lit Christy's cigarette and then he made her take a sip of some kind of alcohol that was wrapped in a brown paper bag. Then he continued pacing up and down the halls, smoking his cigarette. And suddenly, he went across the hallway to Christy's oldest daughter's bedroom, Kayla's bedroom, and he starts rummaging through her drawers. He found a pair of Kayla's pantyhose, and he began cutting them up, and then he stuck them in his pants pocket. When 3:45 came around, the man seemed irritated that Christy's kids were not home yet. He said, I guess your kids are late. And at that point, Christy asked him if he would just do whatever he was going to do and leave before the kids got home. And that's when he told her to shut up. Then Christy asked him if he would let her go to the door when the kids arrived and tell them to go to the neighbor's house and that she would be over to get them in a few minutes. And again, he said no. And then he told Christy to shut up again. When Christy realized that this man wasn't going to leave before her kids got home, she was really scared for them. She didn't want them to come inside and see what was going on. She didn't want them to come in and see their mommy tied up. At that point, Christy didn't ask any more questions. She tried to stay as calm as she could. She didn't want to make this man mad. She was trying not to make the situation worse. 3:50 p.m. came around, and Christy could hear the sound of the school bus pulling up. That's when the man left her room. She couldn't see where he was going. Christy was left on her bed, still bound with the zip ties. A few minutes later, Christy heard the kids come into the house. They were talking about their day. They were laughing together. Her daughter Kayla was the first that she saw coming down that hallway, then Ethan, and then Courtney behind him. When Courtney saw Christy, she said, Mom, what's going on? Do you want me to untie you? And that's when the man jumped out from behind them, grabbed Courtney and put a gun to her head, and he forced all three of Christy's children into that room with her. He told them to get on the floor and put their hands behind their backs, and all three of them did what they were told to do. They were lying face down on their stomachs. The man began putting zip ties on Kayla's wrists first. When this was happening, little Ethan began to cry, and he spoke up. He asked the man, What are you doing? Why are you doing this to my mommy? Then he said, I want to go hug my mommy. How heartbreaking, but also how brave that he spoke up and confronted this man. Surprisingly, the man said, Fine, go hug your mommy. So Christy's little 5-year-old son was clinging to her while the man starts to tie Courtney's hands behind her back, and then he told Ethan to get up. Ethan asked the man, Are you going to put handcuffs on me too? Instead of using zip ties, the man pulled that pair of pantyhose out of his pocket, and he used them to tie little Ethan's hands behind his back as well. After that, the man took Courtney out of the room first. She had been crying so hard that there were tears pooling on the hardwood floors. He shut the door behind him, and then he came back and took Kayla out of the room and shut the door behind him again. I can't imagine how scared they were in this moment. I hate thinking about it. The man came back in once again, and this time he went to take Ethan out. And again, this little boy spoke up. He asked the man, Why are you doing this to mommy? Why are you hurting her? Are you going to hurt me? I love my mommy. Christy wasn't able to hold back her tears when she heard her son say that. She was sobbing. Christy told Ethan, I know you do, baby. It did nothing to deter this man. He took Ethan away from Christy, and he left and shut the door behind him again. Christy didn't know where this man had taken her children. She was so worried about them, and soon enough, the man was back in Christy's room. He was still really calm. He actually took a seat right next to Christy on the bed and sighed, kind of leaned up against her. And he said, Okay, it's either going to be you or your daughter. Christy knew exactly what he meant. It was either going to be that he forced Christy into having intercourse with him, or he was going to do it to one of her daughters. It's disgusting. She immediately said, Please let it be me. And I am so sorry that she had to go through this. It's just awful. In these cases, we don't usually know these details. Sadly, most times these situations don't end well, and the victims usually do not live to tell their stories, and the details that I'm about to relate to you through Christy's words are a lot of things. They're repulsive, they're heartbreaking, unbelievable, terrifying. There are so many emotions that you can only imagine. If we feel these things, how awful Christy must have been feeling when she was going through all this. At this point, the man starts to kiss Christy on the mouth. He told her to use her tongue or she'd be sorry. Next, he cut the zip ties off Christy's ankles with a knife so he could begin to position her for his first ultimate violation of her body. He pulled Christy's shorts all the way off, and he got on top of her and forced her to have intercourse with him. After he was done, he took her into the bathroom and forced her to take a shower to wash herself so the evidence of his semen would be removed from her body. After that, he led her back to the bed, and he sat there for a while without saying a word. But he finally broke his silence to tell Christy that he was going to have to put her out so that she didn't see him leave. Put her out. Well, whatever it meant, whether that meant knock her out or kill her, the man suddenly grabbed her around the neck and he began to strangle her. It was like he snapped. He had been calm this whole time, and then just like that, he became a monster. But I think he had always been a monster. But now, he was acting more like one than ever. He wouldn't let go of Christy no matter how much she fought to get away. When strangling her wasn't working, the man tried to break Christy's neck. Wow. Oh my God, how scary. And Christy fought harder. And when this didn't work either, the man threw her down on the bed and began smothering her with a pillow. Then, he pulled out a knife and started to cut her neck. Not once, but there were 4 different cuts in different directions across the back and a couple times on the front. In both directions, from right to left and left to right. It takes a lot of force to cut this part of the body unless you're using a very sharp instrument. Even some knives can't accomplish clean cuts on the throat. Finally, he let her go and dropped her back on the bed. Christy had no idea where he was going or what he was going to do when he left, but then he came back in and he started to stab her again. One of the strikes was into her left ear canal. That's just unbelievable to me. And he wasn't done. He stabbed her in the lower back as she was just laying there helpless on her bed. Christy didn't know if he was done or if he was just going to keep going. She had no idea what else this man was going to do to her. At this point is when Christy decided her best bet to stay alive was to pretend that she was dead, so that's what she did. She was just laying there as still as possible, so when he came back in, he threw a blanket on top of her body. Christy waited a few minutes before she tried to move. She was waiting for the guy to finally leave. She was laying on the right side with her ear in a pool of her own blood, and her left ear had been stabbed, so she wasn't able to hear anything. However, once she thought the coast was clear, she slowly and carefully lifted her head a bit so she could see from underneath the blanket, and that's when she caught a glimpse of Ethan. He was laying in a room across the hallway. He was laying on top of a pile of pillows, and Christy thought that it looked like Ethan was just laying there asleep, like a tired kindergartner that just got home from school. Christy didn't know what to do, but she wanted to save her children. She was nude from the waist down, so she thought to herself, okay, I know what I will do. I'll get up, I'll wrap this blanket around me, I'll run over, scoop Ethan up, and then we gotta get out of here. But Christy realized she wasn't gonna be able to do that. Her hands were still tied around her back. She wasn't going to be able to wrap the blanket around her. She wouldn't get the chance anyway. The next thing she knew, the man was back, and he was pouring something onto the floor. He lit a match, and he set Christy's bedroom on fire. It's evil. It's pure evil. Christy was still afraid to get up. She didn't know where the man went. She was hoping that he had finally left. She was laying there as long as she could, not moving. She was so worried about her children. But the fire started making its way to her bed. Then she felt her right foot was on fire. But to her utter shock and surprise, when Christy tried to move it, she realized she couldn't move her right leg at all. Christy's legs were paralyzed from the deep wounds to her back. Christy had to think fast. The fire was continuing to rage even larger and more intense. She managed to roll herself off of her bed and onto the floor and rolled towards the French doors that led to the deck out in her backyard and down to her above-ground pool. The doors had those lever-type handles, so Christy tried to pull one of the door handles with her foot, but her legs failed her. She tried again, and then she got stuck in the doorframe, but somehow she lifted her body, and she used her foot to push the handle again, and one side of the French door swung open. All the while, her hair was on fire, parts of her skin were burning, the embers falling from the home were landing on her body and all around her, burning her. All she could do was roll. So that's what she did, all the way into her pool, which was so smart. It was such quick thinking on Christy's part, who definitely had the will to survive, especially for her children. At this point, she had no idea where her children were, if they were inside the house or if the man had taken them somewhere. By the time she got out of the house, the entire side that she was on was engulfed in flames. She could hear things popping and cracking and breaking, and the fire just got hotter and hotter, so much so she actually had to move to the far side of the swimming pool to get away from the heat. And that is when she thought to herself, I can't believe what just happened. By this time, neighbors had seen the flames, someone had called 911 as I explained earlier. And now, Christy could hear voices on the other side of the house, on the side where her kids' bedrooms were. She was still so worried about them. She was hoping that the people she could hear had gotten her kids out to safety. Christy tried to yell for help, but she realized that no sound was coming out. Finally, someone came into her backyard and they yelled, "We got another one!" That's when Christy said she knew they were going to be saved. She said, I knew my children were going to be safe. I knew they would get them out. That's when she also recognized a familiar face. It was her friend, Deputy Kenneth Butts. He was the first officer on scene. He was right up in Christy's face trying to help her. That is when he began asking her, what happened? Who did this to you? I told you that Christy told him she did not know the man. The deputy pressed her, asking if she could just give a description of what he looked like. Christy told him he was a white man and he'd been wearing a blue, short-sleeve polo shirt with the DirecTV logo on it. The man also wore blue jeans, white Reebok athletic shoes, and he had white plastic cable ties and a black handgun. After that, Christy was pulled from the pool, she was put on a stretcher, and she was rushed to the hospital where she was saved. Now, she was lying in the hospital bed telling this story, and I'm sure there was not one dry eye in there. Whether they were law enforcement officers, just there to do their job or not, I'm certain this story evoked emotion in them. If you're a human being, it should. Christy was still so shocked and confused, and she still hadn't seen her children. Christy looked around the room, and one of her first questions, of course, were, where are my children? They're not in the room with her. She couldn't see them as she looked around, but then one of her friends came forward. It was John Mark Vinson. He was the Trigg County coroner. He looked at Christy and he said, "We've been telling you that your children are in good hands, because they are. But they didn't make it." Christy said, "What do you mean they didn't make it?" She was devastated. She began crying. Everyone in that room was crying too, and they started hugging her. Those days, while she was in that medically induced coma, Christy had no idea what happened at the scene of the inferno and what the first responders discovered when they got there. This poor woman had already been through so much. To think that her poor children were also dead is so heartbreaking to me. I almost could not read all these details. Going back to the scene, remember Sean Lowry? He was the brave man who ran into the burning home. Well, once it got too hot, I told you he ran back out, and then he went to the windows to see if there was any way that he could get inside a different way or see anyone, and that's when he saw a foot. Someone's foot was in one of the windows, a foot with a pink sock on it. Sean and other neighbors grabbed a chair and they broke the glass and they began to pull the person out of the burning house. It was Kayla. When they grabbed her legs, they were so hot, it startled them, so they pulled back. And sadly, when they pulled back, it ripped her skin off into their hands. Can you imagine? Once Kayla was on the ground away from the house, that's when the neighbors realized her throat had been cut all the way across from ear to ear, deep enough that her trachea was visible. Her legs and arms were still bound with zip ties. She had been gagged with a pair of pantyhose. Karen Walker and another woman began to administer CPR on Kayla, who was miraculously still alive. Karen remembers how Kayla was struggling to breathe. She was trying so hard to take a breath and gurgling. Deputy Kenneth Butts was there watching this play out, and he knew there was nothing that could be done. The damage to Kayla was too severe. CPR was unsuccessful. When emergency personnel arrived, they put a defibrillator pack on Kayla's heart, but it failed to revive her. Kayla only lived for a few more minutes. Her siblings were still trapped inside the burning house. The fire destroyed the entire home, unfortunately burning Courtney and Ethan's bodies. There was no way for them to be saved. Firefighters from 3 different counties were at the scene: Linton, Herndon, and Caledonia. They were finally able to put out all the flames. By 5:23, emergency responders had called Goodwin Funeral Home for the coroner, John Mark Vinson, to come down. Eventually, Kayla's body was transported to Dr. Deidre Schilluckbeer, the regional medical examiner for Western Kentucky, for an autopsy. Meanwhile, the state's fire marshal's office was being contacted to begin an arson investigation to find out the fire's cause and origin. The state police were also involved to investigate Christie's attempted murder, while they await the medical examiner's autopsy report for Kayla's cause of death. Half a mile of military road, as well as some property surrounding Christie's home, was barricaded off with barrels, cones, and yellow crime scene tape. They wanted to preserve the scene and search for evidence, which included a possible weapon. At this point, no names had been released to the public. After all, Christie's children were minors, and with all 3 deceased, and all 3 having different families, the notification process was more complicated. It was taking more time, and they would not release any information until Kayla, Courtney, and Ethan's fathers were contacted and notified. However, neighbors knew. They were aware of who lived in that home. They knew, with 3 people being left inside the home and Christie at the hospital, it had to be Christie's kids that died. So they were talking to the media right away. They were providing names, even though it was an unofficial record. Already, newspapers were posting pictures of Kayla, Christie, and Courtney in less than 48 hours. However, little was known about what happened in that home, and there was an issue. Once the fire was put out, they had to locate and remove Courtney and little Ethan. That would turn out to be a very difficult task. The issue was preservation. Since this was no accident, each victim needed to have an autopsy conducted, and if the remains were destroyed, that wouldn't be able to be done. So the state called upon forensic anthropologist Dr. Emily Craig. She arrived on scene to attempt to recover the badly charred bodies of Ethan and Courtney and keep them as intact as possible. That is incredible that this can be done. And Dr. Craig explained the remains and the associated debris in this case were so incredibly fragile, so she knew they were only going to get one chance to do it right. But she had come up with a plan. By the next day, Thursday, October 16th, Dr. Craig was at the house to carry out this plan. She carefully and meticulously dug a pathway to the bodies to preserve the crime scene. Ethan was discovered first. There was a lot of debris on top of him, including a bed and a ceiling fan, which were directly on top of his tiny body. Courtney's remains were discovered just 10 feet away from her brother. Now for the even harder task of removing each piece of what was left of them, mostly skeletal at this point. But the doctor managed to recover both bodies, and they were sent to the medical examiner's office in Madisonville, where the same doctor who was working on Kayla's autopsy asked Dr. Craig for her assistance. She needed assistance in the skeletal examination when it came to Ethan and Courtney, which is what Dr. Craig was an expert in. What a process that they had to go through. By Thursday evening, state police spokesperson Dean Patterson confirmed that Kayla's death had been ruled a homicide. Meanwhile, police and now homicide investigators were canvassing this area, asking neighbors if they had heard or seen anything that day or any other day that they thought would be important for this investigation. On the day of the crime, all agencies in this area were told that they should be on the lookout for a bloody man wearing a Direct TV shirt. One of the volunteer firefighters came forward. His name was Matt Ledford. He was only 18 years old, but he was a close friend of Christie's 17-year-old daughter, Kayla. He had a daily routine of coming by her house, saying hello, seeing what everyone was up to. October 15th was no different. He stopped by Christie's around 4:30 p.m. He parked his car, walked to the front door, and knocked. When no one answered, he opened the door and stepped inside, and he said, "I may have stepped inside maybe a foot, a half a foot, that's it." And then he listened to see if he could hear anyone. He didn't, and he didn't even call out or anything because all he could hear was the sound of the swimming pool pump motor. He turned around and left and drove to Hopkinsville. But just as he got in town, he was paged to come out to the fire, and he was shocked that it was at Christy's house. As he arrived back there, he was devastated when he saw the body of his close friend, 17-year-old Kayla Williams, lying near the house, lifeless. Matt stayed at the scene into the next morning. He only left for about an hour in the middle of the night. Wow. I can't believe that he was there when this maniac was inside that house. If only he would have called out, but how incredibly sad. We honestly do not know if his presence would have made much of a difference. He could have been killed too. However, Matt was able to provide a big lead. He told police that when he pulled up to Christie's that day, there was an unfamiliar vehicle parked in her driveway. It was a champagne-colored 2004 to 2006 extended cab Chevrolet Silverado truck with a trailer hitch. And not only that, Matt remembered the first 3 letters of the license plate. Yep, it was H-E-Y. That's why I remembered it, because it spelled hey, the things that you never know are going to be important. But it was. They had a description of a white man who may work for DirecTV that drove an extended cab truck with a license plate that started with the letters H-E-Y. Now authorities were searching for this vehicle. Meanwhile, Courtney and Ethan's autopsies were underway. Both deaths were ruled homicides. The damage to 5-year-old Ethan's thoracic bones, which I'm probably saying wrong, which are the vertebrae, the 33 individual interlocking bones that form your spinal column, they showed that force had been used during this attack on his body. One of his ribs was completely split in half. These children were brutally murdered. Ethan was stabbed 11 times, with one of the wounds penetrating his heart. His sister, 14-year-old Courtney McBurney Frensley, was stabbed at least 4 times. 3 of the wounds were in her chest and 1 in the neck, just like her sister Kayla, who was also stabbed in the neck, along with the slash across her throat. A serrated steak knife had been broken off of the handle during Kayla's attack, and that blade was found inside her sweatshirt. All 3 of these children's deaths were caused by sharp force injuries. So they did not die because of this fire. The fire was most likely started in an attempt to destroy the remains and any evidence of the murders. By Friday, military officials were now on the scene. By that time, Ethan's father, Jeff, had been notified of his son's murder, and he was the one that requested the military's presence. By Saturday, the newspaper revealed that Kayla's father was now on his way from California to Kentucky after being contacted and informed and interviewed about his daughter's murder. Doug said that he was angered after he learned about all of the deaths. He said to think that someone went in there and did what they did to all 3 of those kids. They're an absolute monster, and I hope they find him, end quote. He explained that Kayla had recently moved back in with Christy and that she was the type of girl who would walk into a room and you would think she was an absolute angel in minutes. Courtney's father was also interviewed. He defined his relationship with his daughter as distant, and he said he regretted that, and he no longer had a way to reconcile with her. He stated that he hadn't been in her life for a while, but that he really appreciated other family members for spending so much time with her. He added that he didn't see why this happened. There doesn't seem to be a reason for a vendetta. It seemed to be a random act of violence. And the whole town was heartbroken for these children and their mother. Police spokesperson Patterson told the media that it was probably one of the most horrendous crimes that he'd ever been involved with or known about in that area. But they still did not have a suspect. However, they were following every lead. The biggest one, he told the media, was the apparent association between the killer and DirecTV cable company. Patterson said that the DirecTV corporate office was fully cooperating with the investigation. This information had the town and the surrounding areas on edge. For one thing, residents were apprehensive if they had any upcoming cable appointments. They didn't want anyone from that company in their homes. And not only that, men who worked for DirecTV felt nervous because now they were being questioned about something that they maybe had no involvement in. And people who had loved ones, like their husbands, for example, or family members who work for the company, were now kind of looking at them like, could they be involved? And you're right if you think that police had been questioning men who worked for the company. They had actually been told to stop any DirecTV vans that were driving in the areas and questioned the drivers. One local wife and mother of 3, Stephanie Dunlap, was keeping up to date on the horrendous crime as it unfolded. Not only because she, too, was a mom, but also because her husband Kevin worked for DirecTV. She remembered the day that she heard about the fire. When Kevin came home from work on October 15th, he told her that he had just been pulled over and questioned by police. She asked him why, and he said it had something to do with a house fire. Kevin told her that the police were looking for someone that worked for DirecTV because apparently, according to what he was told, someone saw a DirecTV van around the scene of the fire. But really, it was a DirecTV shirt that Christy had seen the killer wearing. But nonetheless, this is what was being relayed to people as they were being stopped by police. And Kevin, of course, drove a company van during the weekdays, and he said that a bunch of his coworkers had been pulled over that day. Stephanie thought, wow, this is really serious. At that point, not much was being said in the media, and Kevin said that the cops just asked him some questions and then sent him on his way. A couple days later is when Stephanie saw the newspaper article for the first time. The headline read, 3 children dead after house fire. Stephanie couldn't help feeling so bad for that poor family. She thought how awful that they weren't able to get out of that burning house. Stephanie, just like Christy, had 3 children. Her oldest daughter, Brooke, was 13, Kevin Jr. was 11, and little Aiden was only 3 at the time, so it hit close to home for her. It was so heartbreaking for those little ones to lose their life so young. It was hard for Stephanie not to be invested in the case. It's also a small town, so of course, it's what everyone was talking about. Plus, Kevin, he was directly related because he worked for this company that was supposedly connected somehow. Or maybe it wasn't. Since it wasn't really a van, it was only a shirt. The police didn't know if the fact the guy was wearing the DirecTV shirt had any relevance. He could be a former employee, or he could even gotten the shirt at a garage sale or a thrift store, who knows? No one knew for sure. But they were close to finding out because although the authorities were staying tight-lipped, they were running with an even bigger lead. The license plate number that they had been given from Matt Ledford. From just those first 3 letters, they were able to narrow their search to a specific county where the vehicle was registered. Once they tracked it down and got the information related to the vehicle, it matched the description Matt gave, a Chevy Silverado. At that point, they had the name and address of the owner. And when they did a background check, they found out that the man worked for a company called Brewster and Associates, which turned out to be an independent cable installation contractor that had employees who installed and serviced satellite systems for none other than DirecTV in Kentucky. But they were onto something here. Things were adding up. The dots were connecting. Their prime suspect was born in Texas, but had lived in Hopkinsville, Kentucky for most of his life and served in the U.S. Army for more than 13 years, from 1989 to 2002. After being released from the Army, he joined and served in the Kentucky National Guard in Hopkinsville for 2 years. He had been honorably discharged from the elite 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, and they're known as the Night Stalkers. He was a helicopter mechanic, and now he was working full-time installing satellite for DirecTV. The house at the address related to this vehicle registration was a modest 1-story brick home with a horseshoe driveway that sat on the corner of Cox Mill Road and Sterling Drive in Hopkinsville, Kentucky. It was a 25-minute drive to Christie's house from this location, so investigators wondered what the connection may be. They located the suspect at his place of employment and began to follow him starting on that Friday evening. They planned to raid his home the next day on Saturday, October 18th, just 3 days after the murder. They were just waiting on a search warrant and arrest warrant. A DirecTV utility van could be seen parked in the driveway out front of the house that night, and a Chevy Silverado was parked on the other side of the home. By Sunday morning, there were now 2 DirecTV vans outside in the horseshoe driveway, and the SWAT team and several police officers were standing by in unmarked vehicles. They were waiting for a woman and children to leave the premises. As soon as they got the go-ahead with the warrants, they converged on the home. A small explosion was used as a diversionary tactic, and the police set this off before they made their way inside the home to make an arrest. That same day, Stephanie Dunlap had just dropped her 2 older children, Brooke and Kevin Jr., over at their neighbor's house to go run some errands with their 3-year-old Aiden, when a neighbor called her to let her know that something was going on in their usually quiet neighborhood. You know how word travels fast. She said they just heard a loud bang and they brought their children inside the house from playing outside. Stephanie rushed back over to the neighbors to make sure the kids were okay. And that's when she saw it. There was a police car parked outside her house. She went over and she asked, "What is going on?" And they informed her that her husband, Kevin Wayne Dunlap, had just been arrested. Stephanie had no idea what was going on. 2 investigators showed up right after this, and they asked her if she knew why they were there. And she told them, "No, I have no idea." She was told that her husband had been arrested in connection to the house fire in Roaring Springs that occurred on October 15th. She did not understand. Her mind was racing. She said she was just sitting there trying to understand how her husband could be in any way connected to a house fire. And that is when the detectives began to calmly explain to Stephanie that it wasn't just a house fire. The 3 children that had died had been murdered. Their mother tied up and sexually violated and then almost killed. The house was set on fire, but the mother managed to escape by rolling outside into her swimming pool. She was an eyewitness, and the evidence that she and other residents provided to authorities led them to suspect that Stephanie's husband, Kevin, was responsible for this crime. And as you can probably imagine, Stephanie was in total shock. She never for 1 second even considered that her own husband would be involved in anything like this. Everything was in slow motion. Stephanie could hardly breathe. One of the things she thought of was that if he did this, then he came home that night, he ate dinner with her as a family, and then he slept right next to her in bed. It was unfathomable. Could he have really done such a thing? She didn't think he was capable of such evil. How? She had been married to him for 13 years. By 1 p.m. Saturday afternoon, 36-year-old Kevin Wayne Dunlap had been formally charged with 3 counts of capital murder, 3 counts of kidnapping, 3 counts of tampering with evidence, 1 count of attempted murder, first-degree sexual battery, and first-degree burglary and arson. These charges would be enhanced because a firearm had been used during the commission of the crime. State Police Detective Jerry Jones booked Dunlap into the Christian County Jail in Hopkinsville at 4:34 p.m. that afternoon. Meanwhile, the investigators are scouring the Dunlap home and Kevin's vehicles, including his DirecTV work van, and they were looking for evidence. The Silverado was towed to a crime lab for analysis, and the other DirecTV van that was parked outside the home belonged to Kevin's coworker, who was actually inside when the house was raided. Both of the men were escorted outside in handcuffs, then they were surrounded by officers, and they were questioned. Once Kevin was identified, the other man was let go, and he was not involved in the crime. Stephanie didn't know what to think. She did not think her husband was guilty. When she went to the jail to visit him, she asked him, "Why do they think you committed this crime?" She thought that he was going to explain it to her, but he just said, "It was nothing." She's like, "What do you mean it's nothing? They're saying you killed 3 children." He didn't give his wife an explanation or anything, so she didn't know what to believe. Kevin was a father, a husband. Why would he do this? Well, that's what police want to know. And of course, they want to interview those closest to Kevin. Here is the information Stephanie provided about her and Kevin's life together. Stephanie was born and raised in Hopkinsville. She was actually introduced to Kevin through some of her neighbors when she was still in high school. He was 5 years older than her. His demeanor had always been very gentle and kind. She and Kevin were just friends up until later on when Stephanie turned 18. He was 23, and they began dating. At the time, she had a 3-month-old child from a previous relationship, her oldest daughter, Brooke. Stephanie loved how Kevin treated Brooke as though she was his own child. Stephanie and Kevin got married 9 months after they started dating on December 29th, 1995. The 3 of them became a family. They did everything together. Kevin was a hard worker in the military. They were very happy, and Stephanie was in love. Over time, they discussed wanting a bigger family, and after about 1.5 years together, in 1997, Stephanie gave birth to a baby boy they named Kevin Jr. after his father. Then little Aiden followed about 3 years later. Stephanie said the marriage was normal until it wasn't. Things started to change. Kevin became angry towards the children, seemingly for no reason at all. Now, for the first time since I've started talking about true crime cases publicly, I was actually triggered. And I try to be as sensitive as possible, but I also don't want to hide the truth about what people have done. This next part triggered me. And in no way am I going to go into a whole story about me, but I also think it's important to know little things because you may feel the same way and not feel alone if you know others have been there. I grew up with an abusive stepfather. When I was about 2.5 years old, my biological father went to prison and my mom met a new guy. And he had major anger issues. And this story brought me back to how fearful I became as a child. I was shocked at how similar Kevin was to my stepfather. It's the closest a story has ever come. I was in tears when I heard everything that you were about to hear. The first change that Stephanie saw was the way Kevin was treating Stephanie's daughter, Brooke, the one that she and Kevin did not have together, but that he raised since she was born. To Stephanie's surprise, Kevin began to be hypercritical of the littlest things Brooke was doing. One example was at dinner one night. Kevin was glaring at Brooke while she was eating. Mind you, this is a little girl, she's a child. But Kevin started aggressively telling Brooke she was holding her spoon wrong. It wasn't the way that Kevin thought it should be held. This poor little girl sat there trying her best to get it right. But no matter how hard her little fingers tried to readjust his demands, she couldn't do it the way he wanted, and it got to a point where Kevin got physical. This was a turning point. Sure, Kevin had been strict and critical in the past, but now he had taken it to the next level. Even worse, if Brooke shed one tear, Kevin would yell, "I'll give you something to cry about." I heard the same threat as a child, and I learned to cry without tears. Therapy helped. I wasn't allowed to cry, and I felt Brooke's pain so much. I'm allowed to cry now, and these cases help me by sharing other people's pain and crying for them. Another thing, food itself. Brooke was required to eat every crumb of food, whether she liked it or not, and she couldn't move away from the table until she was done. Sometimes she would have to sit there for hours. So you may wonder, where was Stephanie through all this? I wondered where my mom was sometimes. Scared. In a state of fear, that's where. To confront a man like that, it's a risk. As my mother put it, she was scared if she fought back and something were to happen to her, there wouldn't be anyone to protect me. Stephanie said she felt the same way. I felt abandoned as a child, and Brooke sitting alone at that table did as well. Stephanie had to wait until Kevin went to bed or was taking a shower, and then she would come to Brooke's rescue, throwing away all the old food and then making sure to cover it up in the garbage so Kevin wouldn't see it. Then she would tell Brooke to go show Kevin that she was done. If she didn't finish, she would get spanked. And many times that's exactly what happened if Stephanie didn't help her. Stephanie had to smooth things over. What's hard about all this is that there were happy times in between these moments of fear and pain. It was a vicious cycle of push and pull. Stephanie and Brooke both said they looked happy, especially from the outside. Family photos did not show what went on behind closed doors. Kevin became very focused on causing his family pain. His next victim was Stephanie. Sadly, he involved the children in his torture. Not all of us are going to understand this, but Stephanie had a phobia of people touching her feet. Listen, we own our bodies. If something makes us feel uncomfortable, others should respect that and our boundaries, but someone like Kevin used that fear against Stephanie. He pretended it was all in good fun, a game for the kids to play, let's tickle mommy's feet. So all four of them would gang up on Stephanie as she screamed and told them to please stop. But the kids would follow Kevin's lead until he'd had enough, until he got bored with it, leaving Stephanie feeling helpless and defeated. The kids would listen to Kevin because they were scared of him. He seemed to find pleasure in other people's pain, and things got worse, not better, as years went on. Kevin became a loose cannon. His family never knew when he was about to blow up. One afternoon, Kevin came home from work, and as soon as he got through the door, he demanded to know where Stephanie was. He asked Brooke, "Where's your mother?" Stephanie had been napping. Kevin, for no reason, barged into the bedroom and grabbed Stephanie's hair, pulling her off the bed. Being awakened this way was shocking to say the least. She had no idea why Kevin was so agitated. That word. Remember the word agitated. Kevin was just throwing Stephanie around the room, hitting her head onto the wall, just throwing her like a rag doll. All the while she's crying, she's telling him to stop. The kids are witnessing this whole ordeal, but he wouldn't stop. He grabbed her, forced her all the way down the hallway as she's still kicking and screaming, and the kids are scared. And Kevin started screaming for Stephanie to leave, to get out of his house. And he was throwing her outside. But since she knew that Kevin cared about what other people thought, Stephanie figured if people were around, she would be safer, so she was glad she was outside. But she didn't know what she did to deserve this. She just kept apologizing over and over to him. This was the first time the kids had witnessed Kevin treating their mother this way. And then, as quickly as it started, he would just stop, leaving Stephanie bruised and beaten. But he was the man she loved. Let's try hard not to judge Stephanie too quickly for not leaving. I know some of us may wonder, why is she sticking around? Leave him. It wasn't that simple. Even as a child, Brooke said she wondered why Stephanie would let Kevin treat her this way. She knew it wasn't right. And of course, Brooke had experienced it for herself. Brooke wondered why Stephanie seemed to allow this to happen. And Stephanie explained it was because of her fears. Soon, Kevin began getting physical with Stephanie more and more, but he would always strategically bruise her in places that she would cover with clothing. Stephanie considered reporting Kevin to the police, but she was so scared of what would happen to her or the children if he retaliated. It's a very dangerous situation to be in. And at the same time, Stephanie had another job. She was working hard to make sure her family looked as perfect as possible from the outside, all the family photos, the activities they would do together. It all became a facade. Kevin would also be a perfect angel when his mother was around. He acted like a really great husband and father, but it wasn't true. The family was always walking on eggshells around him, and they were pretty good at knowing what would set him off. So the quieter they were, the less trouble they would get into. Stephanie just kept her head down, stayed in college, and knew if she had a way to support herself, then she could finally leave Kevin for good one day and be able to take care of the kids on her own. Things got to a whole new level of fear when Kevin started bringing guns into the home. Stephanie was terrified. You have this person who blows up out of nowhere, and now he's got more than just his fists as weapons. But Kevin insisted the firearms were just there to protect the family. But he turned one of those guns on his children one afternoon. Not a gun full of bullets. This one was a pellet gun. The kids actually never told Stephanie at the time. She found out much later. Brooke and Kevin Jr. were in the living room one afternoon when Kevin broke out his pellet gun and began shooting at them. It hurt. These pellets are made of metal. They burn your skin, and Kevin acted like it was funny watching his children squirm. The kids started screaming and telling him to stop, and he just yelled back, "Shut up." And he kept laughing all the while as his kids screamed in pain. And then he just turned around and walked out. Wow. This next part really terrified and disgusted me. It was Halloween one year, and just like the years before, Stephanie went out and bought Halloween candy, buying Kevin his favorite kind. And while he was at work one day, Stephanie helped herself to a few pieces of Kevin's candy. And when he got home, he noticed there was not as many pieces as before, and he was furious, yelling, "Who ate my candy?" Stephanie was so scared that he would think it was the kids when it was really her, so she quickly told him, "It was me. It was me. I'm sorry." Mind you, this woman went out and purchased the candy for him, so it's so twisted how in his mind he has such entitlement and such claim over something as trivial as Halloween candy. But Kevin was in a rage. He had to teach Stephanie a lesson. No one eats his candy. Stephanie kept apologizing and telling him, "It's okay, I'll buy you more." But Kevin actually took out a real gun this time, and he pointed it at Stephanie. She was shocked. She asked him, "What are you doing?" And he said, "How dare you eat my candy?" Then he told her how easy it would be for him to end her life. He wanted her never to touch his things again. His things. Wow. I'm physically affected by that behavior. It may be my personal trauma, but it makes me cringe and shiver. Stephanie was begging for her life at this point. Over some candy? Can you even imagine? It's frightening to think that a person holding a gun actually has a twisted mindset where they believe this behavior is warranted. And that's the scariest part because you don't know how far they will take it. Stephanie just told him she'll never do it again. She repeated her apology over and over until he finally released her. Not only did he walk away, but he didn't talk to Stephanie for 2 whole months. She tried to make normal conversation with her husband, asking him about his day. Silence. In domestic situations like this, it's common for the person in control to punish the victim. The silent treatment is one very typical way that they do it. The message they're sending is, "You're not even worth their breath." Stephanie was still sleeping in the same bed, yet this man ignored her. Just acted like he had pulled that trigger that day and that she was dead. Dead silence. But it was also the things Kevin did choose to say that made it hard for Stephanie to leave. And I know this all too well. Things about how stupid she was. She wasn't good at anything. She was worthless. She would never be able to survive on her own. There are many ways people try to gain control over others, and one is with their words. And sometimes it's with actual control over something like finances, for example. After years of being told she was worthless, Stephanie started to believe it. She really felt trapped. She felt like she had to stay with Kevin and there was no way out. She kept thinking maybe Kevin would see the light one day, maybe he would change for the better, but that wasn't the case. It usually isn't, but it did seem to get better. Kevin stopped being physical with them, but he was hardly around. He began distancing himself from everyone, spending a lot more time by himself, locked up in his man cave, as Stephanie put it. No one knew what he was doing in there. It was a room above their garage in the house. Kevin seemed to sleep less and less and spend more time locked in this room. He wouldn't even eat with his family anymore, which honestly was good for them. No more worrying about holding utensils incorrectly or being forced to eat when you're already full. They were kind of happy he wasn't around as much. Kevin would go straight to his private room as soon as he came home from work. Stephanie was relieved. She didn't have to deal with him as much anymore. The household was so much calmer. The kids were also getting older, and they would be gone, doing their own activities. So Stephanie enjoyed her time alone. She wouldn't even question or care about what Kevin was doing as long as he wasn't bothering her. She felt good about him keeping to himself. And there were times that Kevin wouldn't even come to bed. Some nights he would be up doing whatever he was doing, unbeknownst to anyone else in the house. Stephanie wouldn't be able to tell if he had left the home either, because he would go right out the garage. Unbelievably, in August of 2004, Kevin and Stephanie actually separated. Perhaps that time alone helped Kevin feel as though it was okay if she left. Stephanie filed for divorce on September 20th, 2004. At this time, Kevin was not employed. He was attending Hopkinsville Community College, and he was receiving $950 a month through the GI Bill for college and another $813 a month in VA disability benefits. While the court proceedings took place, Kevin and Stephanie agreed to the terms for custody agreements and other details like what Kevin would be paying for child support. But less than a year later, by July 12, 2005, the divorce was dismissed because Kevin and Stephanie decided to stay together. Don't ask me why, because there were no details. Maybe the time apart brought back fond memories of better times. I don't know. But what I do know is that there were signs that things were not better. Stephanie explained that one night there was a violent storm outside. It woke her. She noticed that Kevin was not in bed beside her. She wondered where he was, and this time she went looking for him. Where she found him frightened, confused, and disgusted her. She found him in her daughter Brooke's bedroom, in her bed. Of course, Stephanie immediately woke him up. She told him, "Get up." She asked Brooke, who was now awake and confused, why her dad was in bed with her. He hadn't been there when she fell asleep, and it scared her. She was also wondering why her mom was so angry. I think we know why. This was highly inappropriate. Stephanie knew it was something more than Kevin accidentally getting into the wrong bed, and that was concerning. Had he done something to Brooke? No one knew. Brooke said he very well could have, and she could have blocked it out. All she knows is she was never afraid of thunder before that night, but now she was. But Kevin had been drinking earlier in that evening, so Stephanie was trying to give him the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he did just kind of wander in there and pass out. All Brooke knew was now when she heard thunder, she curled up into a ball and cried, something she hadn't done before this. But now it was a triggered response. Wow. That's terrifying to think that he may have done something. Kevin began working again, and he had several jobs, finally landing his job installing satellite TV. Stephanie told the police that she remembers one night, it was around 9 p.m. She noticed Kevin was kind of like getting ready like he was going somewhere. She was confused. He had his DirecTV uniform on. This time she asked him where he was going. She already knew there was no way he was going to work. She actually thought he was cheating. So she figured, you know what? Let me see what excuse he gives me. Kevin told her without even missing a beat that he had a call to go install a satellite system. She kind of snapped back at him saying, "Really? This late?" And he responded, "Well, one of us in this house needs to work." Insulting Stephanie as usual. She knew he was lying, but she let him think that she was stupid enough to believe him. They didn't get calls at night to install a satellite TV, not that late. Stephanie wasn't stupid, but she let it go. When she noticed how long he was gone that night, she really was concerned. She thought, wow, he's living a double life, probably with some other woman. I would be like, go ahead, let him leave, but wait until you hear what happened next. Not too long after this late night secret outing, Stephanie came home with the kids one afternoon to see a large amount of blood on their living room floor. She didn't have much time to think about it because she saw Kevin. He was sitting there holding his hand. It was gushing blood. And Stephanie, in a panic, is like, oh my God, what happened? It was a serious cut. Kevin said he cut his hand open while he was working on his truck. Stephanie knew they would need to leave for the emergency room. There was no way that this cut was going to stop bleeding without medical intervention. And Stephanie just kept wondering, why didn't he call me immediately and tell me what happened so that we could get him to the ER faster? Well, I'm sure there were reasons for that. Stephanie rushed to get Kevin to the hospital, and once they got there, a doctor started to check out his hand. It was a bad cut, like I said, and of course, they asked Kevin, like they do with every patient, tell us what happened here. Kevin explained what he already said to Stephanie. He cut it while he was working on his truck. The doctor looked a little puzzled. He questioned Kevin about his answer, kind of challenging him by saying, really? You did this on your truck? And the tone of the way the doctor was saying this was one in disbelief. Kevin repeated, yes, that's how it happened. The doctor responded that he was surprised because it was such a clean cut. Stephanie, sitting there listening to all this, just quietly taking it in. And when the doctor explained the cut was clean, and he used that word clean, Stephanie thought it meant it didn't have dirt in it. So that's why the doctor was confused. But really, that's not it. In medical terms, and specifically forensic medical terminology, when a cut is clean, it came from a source that can make an even or clean slice. Instruments that create clean cuts are usually very sharp, like knives, whereas a cut that's more jagged could be created by a lot more of instances than a perfect one. When doctors see cuts like this, they're trained to alert authorities because they could be looking for a suspect involved in a crime, including a sharp force injury. Accidental cuts are not as precise as wounds that are very clean across and show cleanly divided edges and may involve different types of tissue with the same contact all the way through, just like one swipe. Kevin did not like being questioned by this doctor, and soon there were a couple police officers standing in his room. Stephanie was very surprised by the way Kevin was reacting to their presence. The officers just asked him, what was going on? Tell me what happened to your hand again. Again, he told them he cut it on his vehicle and asked them why it mattered. And he came off very defensive. The officers were like, okay, calm down. We're just asking necessary questions here. And that's when Kevin kind of snapped back and said something to the effect of like, why are you acting like I'm lying? So the officers tried to calm him down by explaining that they're just trying to make sure a number of things. One, that it wasn't someone else who cut him, and that him and his family were safe. Like maybe he got into a fight and the person cut him and he was trying to defend himself. It's just their job. Agitated. That's how Stephanie chose to describe Kevin in this instance. Agitated. She said that she saw him begin to get agitated and she was familiar with this reaction. And when officers finally left, she did not dare inquire about why it agitated him so much. All they were doing was questioning him. She was scared that he would get more agitated, and I couldn't help but think, what an interesting way to describe this man and how he was acting. But Stephanie saw the signs. He was beginning to feel the pressure, and he could be set off at any moment, so she knew when to stay silent. The medical professionals took care of Kevin's cut, and they went back home. It was not too long after this incident that Stephanie found out about the fire in Roaring Spring. She saw that article in the newspaper and she remembered Kevin coming home that day and saying that he had been pulled over and questioned by police, but he seemed to think that it wasn't that big of a deal. Now, her husband was sitting in a jail cell. Stephanie knew that Kevin was capable of getting physical with his own family, but she couldn't imagine him having any reason to hurt other people. It just didn't make sense to her. It didn't have to. Sometimes these things never make sense to people who don't think like a killer. But Stephanie did remember something that stood out to her. A couple nights after she read about the fires in the newspaper, her daughter Brooke had a friend spend the night. They were having fun, they were watching movies on the couch, and then they made little beds out in the living room just like most teenagers do, having a good little sleepover. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary to Stephanie. But what she didn't know until later was that Brooke's friend woke up in the middle of the night to see Kevin standing in the living room, staring out the window into the darkness outside. Then he was pacing back and forth over and over again, as though he was waiting, he was watching, he was acting nervous and scared. And Brooke's friend was scared enough that she thought she should say something because it was unsettling. After police arrested Kevin, they sat him down for questioning, and he denied having anything to do with the crime. In his words, he told investigators that he would deny it until the day he died, and that he had nothing to do with it. Well, that's not what investigators thought. They already had their minds made up, and there were solid reasons for that. I'll get to those in just a moment. So they pressed him. One investigator straight up asked Kevin, was it an urge? Did it just overwhelm you to do this? Because as I explained, people who are thinking clearly don't do this. They don't hurt people this way. And we want to make sense of the senseless. Kevin just answered with, I didn't do it. And his arms stayed tightly crossed. He was still wearing his blue DirecTV shirt that he had been arrested in. The investigator didn't back down. He was like, you just showed up in their driveway and went in there and killed them all randomly? They were still trying to make the connection between Kevin and Christy's family at this time. Kevin responded with, I didn't do anything. He was so calm in this interview. He kept a straight face, and he was pretty believable. But investigators knew they had their man. So they asked him if he was just going to keep denying this. Kevin said, yes, absolutely, I'm going to deny it. I had nothing to do with this. Watching what short clips I could find, I can understand why Stephanie wasn't sure what to believe. Kevin's pretty convincing, but the evidence doesn't lie. We already know Kevin's Silverado was seen at the crime scene at 4:30 p.m. If he had never been in Roaring Spring, then what was his truck doing in Christy's driveway? Not only that, going back through Kevin's history with his wife Stephanie and the background checks, it was revealed that not only had Kevin been to Roaring Spring before, he had lived there with his family. That is unreal. This man's still trying to deny it. In the fall of 2004, during the time that Stephanie and him were going through their divorce, the Dunlap family was living at 11 Compton Road in Roaring Spring. This was literally 6 houses away from Christy and her family. The proximity of Kevin's former home to the Frensley residence raised the possibility that at the very least, Kevin had seen Christy and her kids before, or their kids could have even played together. The 2 homes were less than 2/10 of a mile apart. Now let's go to the evidence found at Kevin's residence. The state police crime lab technicians took 21 swabs of suspected blood from that home, including a pair of white Reebok sneakers that appeared to have dried blood on them, and perhaps some ash or soot. These were the exact style shoes that Christy reported the killer was wearing. Police also seized rope, cable ties, several blue polo-style shirts bearing the DirecTV logo, 2 handguns, and copies of DirecTV work orders for October 15th that were thrown in the trash. When presented with this evidence, Kevin finally said that he did have a service order down there approximately 2 weeks before the killings, but he still denied being there the day of the crime. All the suspected blood that the investigators found on Kevin's shoes, in his truck, it all had to be tested. Meanwhile, they put Kevin into a lineup with pictures of 5 other men, and they showed these pictures to Christy. They asked her if she could identify the man that attacked her that day. She looked. She really examined the photos, but she wasn't confident that she could pick out the person who killed her family because even though she said that he resembled the man that she saw, she couldn't say with 100% certainty because his hairstyle was a little bit different and it looked like he was trying to cover his hair with his hand in the photo. Christy was also healing from such a traumatic event, losing all of her children and almost dying. She did choose Kevin out of the lineup, but she couldn't be 100% certain it was him. 11 days after Christy almost lost her life, she was finally leaving the hospital to attend her children's funeral. Goodwin Funeral Home coordinated the combined funeral service for all 3 victims, Ethan Frensley, only 5 years old, and his sisters Courtney McBurney Frensley, 14, and Kayla Williams, 17. Because of the potential for so many people to be in attendance, they decided to have it at the Trigg County High School Gymnasium, with the actual burial scheduled for October 31st. at the Rose Hill Cemetery in Mason. Wow. A Halloween funeral. It's so sad because I brought my daughter home from the hospital on Halloween. Tears of joy versus tears of sadness. Each family member suffered a terrible and tragic loss. They provided pictures, wrote down memories, and provided some poems that their children have written. Christy Frensley sat in a wheelchair in front of the 3 caskets that belonged to her children. I think I owe it to this mother to read her words, just as she had a friend do at this funeral. She was unable to get the words out herself. I'm sure you can imagine how hard it was. It was too hard. So a friend read what Christy wrote in tribute to her children who were gone too soon, and I'm going to read that to you. Every life tells a story. Each life has an introduction. That's the day we were born. A plot. That's the life we live. And a conclusion. Our death. Some are short stories. Some are full-length novels. And some stories barely have time to introduce the characters before they end. My life story began the day I was born, and my favorite 3 chapters tell of the days that my children Kayla, Courtney, and Ethan were born, and I became their mother. When we began our life together as a family, our story has been filled with laughter, fun, adventure, challenges, lots of hugs and kisses, happy times with our friends and family, and plenty of drama, as life will be living with 2 teenagers and a little kindergartner. Some of you attending today are family and close friends of ours. Many of you here are classmates, teachers, and friends with my children. Kayla, Courtney, and Ethan have been a part of your life story. Since many of you are still in school, you should remember the questions to ask when you read and try to understand a story. They are who, what, when, where, and how. Today, I want to look at this chapter of my life story and the life story of my children and try to get some answers to questions not only but I know you are asking. Who? Who is God, and why did he let this happen to me and my children? God is who he is, not what we want or try to make him to be. He's not a Santa Claus who writes down a wish list and gives Christians what they want. He never promised that he would protect us from problems while we're here on this earth. If that were true, everyone would sign up for him. He will not shelter us from life's troubles, but he will be there with us through them. Where? Where are my children now? All 3 of my children are together and in heaven. I did not lose them. I know where they are. They are alive, completely safe, and perfectly happy. They have beautiful new bodies, and they're waiting for me. What? What do I do with the anger and rage I feel towards the man who abused my children and me in ways too horrific to describe and left us to die? I know it will be a process for me, but I choose not to give in to hate. If I allow myself to be chained to hate, I will again become his prisoner, and I cannot and will not allow him to have any more control over my life. I just want justice to the fullest extent of the law, and I know that one day my God will judge him for what he has done to our family, and that will be a fearful thing. When? When will I see my children again? I don't know, but God knows, and he has promised me from his word that I will see them again in heaven, and when we're reunited, there will never be another separation. How? How am I going to live with this pain and loneliness now that my reason for living aside from my life with Christ is gone? My answer to that is, I don't know. All I know is that God will give me strength to go on, and he's already comforting me by reminding me that the separation from my children is temporary. I also know that God kept me alive for a reason, and I must find that reason. I know Kayla, Courtney, and Ethan want me to go on. The final chapter has been written in the story of my children's lives on earth, but a new story has just begun for them now in heaven with my beautiful Savior. In closing, I know that if Kayla, Courtney, and Ethan could speak to us today, there are a few things they would want to say. 1, we know you will miss us, but please go on. Life is so short, and we will only be separated temporarily. 2, do not give in to hate, bitterness, or fear. We know you're struggling to cope with our death. Get help, read the Bible, go to church, get counseling. 3, evaluate your life and invest in things that really count, because you don't know when your final chapter on earth will be written. And 4, accept Christ as your Savior as we did. You know we weren't perfect kids, but God didn't expect that from us. 5, Mom, Dad, Grandma, and Grandpa, aunts, uncles, cousins, and friends, we love you so much. Thank you for everything you've done for us. See you soon. Christy ended by telling everyone, thank you so much for your prayers and support. Wow. I'm sure there was not one dry eye in that gymnasium. I can see why Christy couldn't read that. It's very emotional. About 800 people, including relatives, attended the visitation and funeral. Many of them were classmates and other children from the community. They all walked by the closed caskets one last time to say goodbye. A teacher, classmates, and ministers spoke during the funeral. Pictures of the children and home videos of them were shown on 2 big screens above their caskets. And 3 candles on the gym stage burned throughout the service. And I've actually lit 3 special candles in my set today in their honor. And I did this while reading Christy's words. Kayla and Courtney had white caskets, and Ethan had a small John Deere green casket that sat between his sisters. Crying could be heard throughout the entire gymnasium, especially when they showed a home movie with Ethan singing the song Last Dollar, Fly Away by Tim McGraw. When you listen to that song, think of these children. Kayla played the guitar and Courtney used the kitchen table as a drum. The first verse of that song is, 1, 2, 3, like a bird I sing, 'cause you've given me the most beautiful wings. Wow, it's eerily fitting. Rest in peace, Courtney, Ethan, and Kayla. They were laid to rest, but now justice had to be done. The grand jury heard the evidence that investigators found, the blood on a door handle and a seatbelt of Kevin's truck. The prosecution said they would seek the death penalty. Kevin pleaded not guilty. The bail was set at $3 million, $1 million for each victim that he had killed. There was enough probable cause and circumstantial evidence presented to get an indictment. Now the real investigation had to take place. They were in waiting mode. It could take weeks, even months, for blood and semen to be tested, and the trial was moved out of Cadiz and into a neighboring county of Livingston. There were many pretrial hearings, as there are with every case of its kind. Christy did not come to many of them, but she was at the pretrial conference in April of 2009 as the trial approached, which was set for November. Here's a picture of her looking at Kevin as he was escorted out of the courtroom that day. If you look closely, you can see the scars on her neck. She was having to see Kevin in court, and that was really hard on her. But she had to be strong for her children. The evidence was still being tested at this point to get ready for trial. There was suppression hearings because, of course, the prosecution was trying to get certain statements admitted that the defense didn't want, like a statement that Kevin made when the officers showed up at his house when they were trying to effectuate the arrest. When they asked him whether he knew why they were there, he said something to the effect of, is it about the Roaring Springs deal or the Roaring Spring thing? And this was before he was read his Miranda warnings. And I wanted to point something out. There was a comment on one of my last videos where someone said that only guilty people are read Miranda warnings. That is actually not correct. Miranda rights stem from the Fifth Amendment in the United States Constitution. And a lot of us are familiar with this statement. It starts with, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you can't afford one, one would be appointed to you. The wording can be slightly different depending on the jurisdiction, but Miranda rights were created in 1966 as a result of the United States Supreme Court case Miranda versus Arizona. The Miranda warning is intended to protect the suspect's Fifth Amendment right to refuse to answer self-incriminating questions. It's all about preserving evidence that can be used at trial. That's why we call it pleading the Fifth, because it's the Fifth Amendment. Just because someone is arrested doesn't mean they're guilty of a crime. That has to be proven. But when they're being questioned in relation to a crime, a suspect will be read a warning that essentially says, if you talk after this, we're going to use your words against you in court. And in this case, the prosecution wanted to admit Kevin's 5-hour interview plus what he said at the door. And they were fighting about this being admitted or not. Ultimately, Judge Woodall said he's not going to allow the statement Kevin made when police came to the door. But the statements during his interview were admissible. With the trial approaching, the defense, of course, filed to delay it so they could do their own independent testing of all the evidence. And because Kevin was undergoing mental health testing, I mentioned this because there's going to be a bombshell dropped very soon, and I want to highlight what was going on here. The judge granted the delay, especially because this was a death penalty case. It was pushed from November 2009 to February 2010. Let me tell you what was going on behind the scenes because it was shocking. First of all, Stephanie finally decided to believe that her husband was capable of committing this crime, especially when he wouldn't answer her about why they thought he did it. He said that everything would come out at trial, so she took that as him admitting he did it. They eventually got a divorce, and I wanted to mention, Brooke was having a hard time dealing with everything. So finally, Stephanie made a decision to finally let her know Kevin was not her biological father. All those years, she actually had no idea that she had no blood relation to this man who raised her since she was a baby. It was actually a huge relief when Brooke sat down with her therapist and her mother, and the truth was revealed to her. She still considered Kevin her father, but it did relieve her to know she did not share his blood. I want to go back to criminals because they have rights. People who are accused of crimes have rights, and our judicial system takes those rights very seriously. Kevin was sent to Kentucky Correctional Psychiatric Center for a 30-day evaluation of his competency to stand trial. A month later, it was found that he was competent. However, just a month before the trial was set to begin, something huge happened that would make this case very unique. Kevin's court-appointed attorney, James Gibson, actually asked the court for an indefinite delay. They needed this for additional testing. The judge responded with this, quote, "At a risk of sounding flippant, you need to tell them to hurry up." But Gibson argued it was better to have a fair trial than a fast one, all the while knowing there was something really important that they needed to get to the bottom of without giving it away just yet. Well, the defense attorney tried to get the judge off the case when he had denied this other delay. He cited a conflict of interest because, remember, Woodall actually presided over the divorce between Christy and Jeff Frensley just months before the murders occurred. But Woodall declined to recuse himself, saying that that case had no bearing, had no effect on this one. That yes, it's true, he did decide to grant Christy custody of Ethan just 15 days before he was ultimately murdered, but he presumed Kevin innocent until proven guilty, just like with every other case. He also thought this was a pretty bad tactic of the defense, but maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. Well, just a month before the trial, the Kentucky Correctional Psychiatric Center did a CT scan on Kevin's brain as part of his medical and mental health evaluation, and it raised some pretty serious concerns, ones that the defense had to bring to the judge. This is what the scan found, and I'm probably not going to pronounce this right. They found 2 non-specific hyperattenuate punctate foci on Kevin's right frontal lobe on his brain. So if there are any doctors or soon-to-be doctors that are medical students and you want to comment, please do. But basically how I understood it, in easy to understand terms, they scanned his brain and noticed an abnormality. And they wanted to do further testing to find out what it was, because the frontal lobe of the brain, it controls judgment, self-control, inhibition, and social interaction. It's a very important part of your brain. Your brain's frontal lobe is the home to areas that manage thinking, emotions, personality. So it was definitely relevant to have further testing done on Kevin to see what was going on. The defense filed a motion for a complete neurological examination, including an MRI and a PET scan. The judge did approve the request for these exams, but he would not delay the trial. Just as the jury selection was beginning and everyone was there, including Christy and both Doug Williams and Jeffrey Frensley, the fathers of Kayla and Ethan, the judge read the charges and asked Kevin what his plea was. And to everyone's surprise, and against the advice of his attorneys, Kevin pleaded guilty to all charges. Judge Woodall asked Kevin why he was pleading this way, and he said he thought it was the right thing to do. Now, I have to tell you something weird that happened while I was researching. This is a little segue for a second. I was reading this article about this case, about Kevin's plea, and then right underneath, I see a headline, "Judge won't require televangelist deposition in the lawsuit." And I was like, wait, what? Because last week I just did the Coleman case involving Joyce Meyer, and right here in this newspaper, right here is an article relating to that case that I just did, and it kind of gave me a little chill. I know both cases happened in 2008, so it kind of made sense that they would both be still going on 2010 or just finishing up, but it was just something I wanted to mention. If you haven't seen that case, by the way, it's the longest deep dive I've ever done. And a lot of you said it showcased many more details that you hadn't seen in other videos or news reports, so if that's your thing, check it out. Now back to this case, because this next part is intense, I want to tell you it. Apparently, Kevin tried to plead guilty but mentally ill, and the judge rejected that plea. However, in the background of all this, what was happening was a clinical neuropsychologist was set to testify about lesions on Kevin's brain that were found when they did the scans. Dr. Michael Nicholas explained that these lesions were a collection of blood vessels about the size of a cubic inch in the frontal lobe of Kevin's brain. Parts of the cortex, the thinking part of the brain, and the white matter, the communicating part of the brain, were actually missing in this section, which ultimately meant that Kevin could experience things like headaches, depression, and more importantly, it could impair his judgment or cause him to lose control. The prosecution asked Dr. Nicholas why nothing was found when he did his initial evaluation, and he explained, well, as a matter of fact, I took note that Kevin's personality did not match personalities of people who usually commit these types of crimes, and that's why he wanted to have him further tested, saying that his personality was different. Well, then the prosecutor argued that people who suffer with depression do not usually commit these types of crimes either. Maybe that wasn't the best argument, but guess what? Ultimately, Judge Woodall accepted Kevin's guilty plea and moved to the next phase, which would determine whether Kevin would be sentenced to life or face the death penalty. Having heard statements from both sides, the judge ruled that he didn't think Kevin was mentally ill, and therefore the plea was going to stand. Kevin understood the charges against him, and he was giving clear statements to the court. Now for the penalty phase. This picture was snapped of Kevin talking to one of the assistant defense attorneys on his defense team during jury selection for the penalty phase. I just wanted to show you, he's just smiling and carrying on like his life isn't hanging in the balance right now. They called 126 potential jurors for questioning. Any extreme opinions for or against the death penalty would get a juror dismissed. It was all about a balance. To be as impartial and open-minded, you had to be okay with him getting the death penalty or not, depending on the evidence. 6 potential jurors said that they wanted to see him put to death. And if they served on the jury, they would make sure it happened. Of course, they were dismissed. And on the other hand, 2 other potential jurors said that they refused to consider the death penalty. They said they did not want to be responsible for another man's death regardless of the crime he committed. And they were also excused. There's a picture of Kevin and one of his attorneys chatting on the day these potential jurors were being questioned. Finally, February 19, 2010, a jury of 8 women and 4 men were seated and ready to hear from both sides. First, the opening statements from the prosecution, which began with this statement from Commonwealth's attorney, Ove. 3 living human beings on October 15, 2008, he said, standing in front of the pictures of the children. He continued saying, lives worth living, but the evidence shows that this killer took that away. He pleaded with the jury to impose death on Kevin Dunlap, saying that these precious human beings, if ever the facts warranted the imposition of the death penalty, it was these facts. Then he highlighted what I told you happened on the scene that day, including testimony from Sean Lowry, who bravely went inside to try to rescue the children, all the neighbors that I told you about, Karen Walker through tears, saying that she was screaming that there was babies in there. This was an intense day for the jury. They also heard from EMTs and nurses and doctors, everyone who tried to save Christy, Kayla, Courtney, and Ethan. This is what Kevin looked like that day, as he listened. The next day, it was Christy's turn to bravely take this stand, and she told the court everything I told you that she went through, including that final hug from her son, the tears that her daughter cried on that hardwood floor, and how she tried to be brave for them. She says she remembers it like it was yesterday, and I'm sure she will never forget it. She was overcome with sadness to the point that they had to take a break to let her regain her composure. Kevin would not give Christy eye contact, nor would he look at any of the other witnesses. The jury also heard from the medical examiner and the anthropologist. The prosecution also called detectives to showcase all the evidence that was collected, like this shoe found at Kevin's home that tested positive for blood, and the DNA from Christy's vaginal swab that matched Kevin's DNA. This was the evidence against Kevin. A female DNA profile collected from the left Reebok shoe matched Courtney Frensley, and it was estimated that it was 1 in 12 quintillion. That's 1 followed by 18 zeros. A Crown Royal bottle wrapped in a small brown paper bag was collected from Kevin's garage. You remember how he had her sip out of a bottle of alcohol wrapped in a brown paper bag? Well, the DNA matched Christy Frensley. Swabs from boxer shorts at Kevin's house were consistent with a mixture of Kevin and Christy's DNA. Inside the driver's seat of Kevin's vehicle, the seatbelt had Christy's DNA on it. When it was the defense's turn Starting on February 23rd, they called 3 doctors to testify, including radiologist Dr. Eric Shields, and he said that mass of blood vessels was the size of a ping pong ball. And it probably had been in Kevin's brain since he was born, and that this section of his brain showed no activity on a PET scan. Then a neurologist, Christopher King, said that the odds of a person with this disorder is 1 in 100,000 or even 1 in a million. But when he was asked if he thought that it would have affected Kevin's behavior, he said that he could not be sure. He doesn't know, but it can definitely cause personality changes, memory issues, and even brain bleeds. The jury finally heard from Dr. Nicholas, who I mentioned earlier, the one who ordered the additional testing to begin with. He wanted to point out that this part of the frontal lobe is responsible for inhibitions. It's the portion of the brain that considers consequences, and that antisocial behavior might not have been displayed when Kevin was in the service for the 10 years he was in the Army because it was so disciplined. But he couldn't say for certain if it did or did not cause him to commit these murders. He said that some people can still function normally and have right frontal lobe abnormalities. As a rebuttal witness, the prosecution called Dr. Amy Trivette. She was a psychiatrist from the Kentucky Correctional Psychiatric Center. She conducted the competency test on Kevin. She said the lesions were incidental. She said nothing suggests that it has any effect on his behavior. He knows the difference between right and wrong, and he can conform his behavior according to the law. Someone else was in that courtroom to testify that day. Kevin's own mother. The one that he used to play nice with, the one he would act like a perfect husband in front of. Sheila Dunlap. She said she couldn't believe it when she heard that Kevin had been arrested for the killings. She said she was stunned and said, quote, "I couldn't believe it because I know his heart and I know how much he loves children," end quote. She testified on behalf of her son. She told the jury he didn't have a normal childhood because he had a domineering father. However, she did mention some similarities in Kevin, like his father's need for the children to be perfect. He was very strict on him. In closing, the defense attorney argued to the jury that Kevin shouldn't be put to death, that death wasn't the answer, that he had mental health issues, and they pleaded with the jury to think of Kevin's own children, his 7-year-old son, that he wouldn't understand the death sentence of his father. Think of the effect the death penalty was going to have. He said, quote, "Their father killed some children. Killing is wrong. And to show that killing is wrong, they kill him? Does that make sense to a 7-year-old? End quote. Some children, huh? They were more than some children. They were Kayla Williams, Courtney McBurney Frensley, and Ethan Frensley. Now it was in the jury's hands. 3 hours later, they were ready for their verdict to be read. Their recommendation? A death sentence for each of the children's killings and for each of their kidnappings, so 6 death penalties in total. Here's Christy when the verdict was being read. Army Major Doug Williams, Kayla's dad, said he wanted to say something to Kevin, and he would when he was sentenced. He told everyone that the most important thing in his life was missing now, and there was never going to be repayment. Nothing replaces the pain that Christy and he and her stepmother and stepfather Jeff would have to endure from her being dead. Finally, the day was here, March 19th, 2010, when Kevin was officially sentenced to death, in addition to the sentence of 3 life sentences and 55 years for what he did to Christy. Judge Wordle said, "Given the severity of all of the offenses, I'm imposing the maximum sentence allowed on all counts." Now for what Kayla's dad said to Kevin. He said, quote, "You are nothing but a hollow shell of what was possibly once or should have been a man. However, you're not a man, but instead you're a coward and a monster. You're nothing but pure evil that attacked helpless and innocent children and their mother." End quote. He went on to say that even though he's a Christian, that he can't forgive Kevin. He wants Kevin to one day explain his actions and to confess to any other crimes that he may have committed. Doug said that nothing brings him more pleasure than him being sentenced for the crimes that he had done. And the only regret that he had was that he wasn't allowed to determine Kevin's punishment on his own and carry it out as his personal executor. And Kevin sat there emotionless. Doug went on to say, quote, "I still find it hard to understand how you can sit motionless, emotionless, and void of reaction as the many photos and accounts of the aftermath of your crimes were described in great detail to this courtroom. It's clearly evident that you have no remorse for your crimes against my family and this society." End quote. Here's a picture of Christy with the prosecutor, who Christy referred to now as part of the family. Stephanie had an assumption about why she thought Kevin may have committed this crime. She said that she saw similarities between their family and Christy's family. For example, 3 children of similar age groups, and the fact that he could have possibly tried to become sexual with Stephanie's daughter Brooke in the past. Perhaps Kevin had a fantasy about that and found a family to carry out that fantasy, considering Christy had 2 young daughters. And remember what he said, it's either going to be you or your daughter. Not to mention the fact that he seemed to want to harm his family, but perhaps if he would have, it could have been too obvious that he was the perpetrator, whereas maybe he thought that he could get away with it, and he had this pseudo-family to carry out these heinous crimes upon. The fact that they lived in such close proximity to Christy's family also suggests that he could have seen Christy and her family before, and maybe he didn't like that they were seemingly happy, whereas he was so unhappy in his situation, but we will never know. The judge remanded Kevin to the custody of the Kentucky Department of Corrections, and he said, quote, "Good luck to you, sir," end quote. Kevin got an automatic appeal to the Supreme Court following his death sentence. It's actually mandatory in Kentucky, and I read this long document. It was submitted August 15, 2011. It was 173 pages. I'm going to spare you. However, it is very interesting, and in every case, I leave a link below to all of my sources. So by all means, if you want to read it, I'll even directly link it below. Go ahead. Feel free. But I will paraphrase just to let you know that the defense mentioned the fact that there was only 6 days before the trial when they got these additional scans done, and that the clinical psychologist, Dr. Nicholas, who we already heard from, reviewed these results, and they believed that the lesion was very significant, and it would have impaired Kevin's capacity in terms of self-control, judgment, and there was so much literature about the abnormal behavioral consequences of frontal lobe lesions, they just didn't have time to present them to the court because the judge refused to delay the trial so that they could prepare. There were all types of things shown in this report. Stuff about Kevin's personality, who he would have been, that he didn't even commit violent crimes in the past. He didn't have a tendency to act out towards others, which we know isn't true because he physically harmed his own family. But according to doctors, he had a normal life. He was married, he held down a job. But I'm sitting here thinking, a lot of people who commit crimes have quote unquote normal lives and they still commit heinous acts. In this appeal, there were pages and pages about his disorder and about previous head injuries and head traumas when he was in the Army. I'm not going to go in all the details, but they were just trying to prove that Kevin really didn't know what he was saying in court when he answered certain questions. And to cut to the chase, the appeal was denied and the death penalty was upheld. So he stayed on death row in Eddyville, Kentucky. But this man's team will not quit. Just last year, they once again were filing motions for a new trial, saying that there was insufficient counsel. And it was still ongoing the last time I checked. They just want the death penalty overturned. Look at this man. He's 50 years old in this picture, and he is where he belongs. I want to end with Christy and her words. She said, quote, "When you lose your kids, I don't think you ever heal emotionally. It's just something you never get over." End quote. But despite her grief, she wanted her story to be told because she hoped that it would help others who may have gone through something like this. Maybe someone has lost a child or children, and this could help them. She knows her story is sad, but she survived because of how much she loved her children. She fought to stay alive for them. That is what kept her alive. I want to keep their memories alive with this video, and I wanted more people to know Christy's story. After all of this, poor Christy was diagnosed with stage 2 breast cancer in November of 2018, and by January of 2019, she underwent a double mastectomy. I am so sorry, Christy. You deserve all the happiness in the world. I will never forget Kayla, Courtney, and Ethan, ever. And I hope that none of you will forget them, and they will always be remembered. Thank you so much for being here, giving this family your time, and watching this video. I will see you in my next one. Bye.